Hello and welcome to Shree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm the executive producer of Shree's show and the occasional guest host. We have a great show planned for today, and I want to give a special shout out to everyone watching on on video afterward. We are going to be having our guest Libby Copeland join us in just a few minutes, and we'll have Shree join us as well to have a couple of announcements about Social Media Weekend and talking about a series of phone calls he's doing around COVID-19. So please let us know where you're watching from, and make sure you hit share. I'm going to hit share as well on my tablet as we get going. And with that, I'll bring on Shree real quick for a few quick announcements.
Hi, Neil.
Hey, how are you doing?
This is great to have you host and me kind of sit back and do a little bit of production work while you're doing this. Good morning, everyone from New York. Neil is right now in suburban DC. I'm in Manhattan, and I was not supposed to be in town because I was supposed to be at an 85th birthday party in Florida, and I obviously ended up not going, and I am now here. I just want to thank Neil Parekh and Paula Kiger in Tallahassee and Steve Taylor in Philly for hosting these read-alongs every Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Please tell us where you're watching from. Please hit share right now so your friends and family can join us. We do this every Sunday. It's a global conversation. For 4 years, we did it basically only on Facebook Live, but now we're on LinkedIn Live as well, and it's all archived on my YouTube channel. So it's an incredible opportunity for you to keep up with the news and also meet fantastic guests like today's guest, and also occasionally New York Times reporters and writers and editors. I wanted to let you know that in this time of hunkering down, we don't have to be, socially distant, even though we're physically distant. We can be socially distant in a physical way, but we can be online and sharing, as we've proven with this weekly conversation. And so as part of that, every day at a different time, but today at 5 p.m., I am hosting what I call a COVID call. It's an open phone call that anybody from the world can join us. And this is the third day that we're doing this, and I'm doing it because I want to make sure I'm connected to people, and we've had folks calling in and just sharing. I like to say we let you shoot the breeze because we can't shoot the virus, and just a chance to chat about anything. I try to have a guest. Today we have Bob Anthony, who's a veteran tech journalist and just a terrific tech and journalism background that he has. He has 1.2 million followers on Pinterest, for example. And Bob and I will chat about some tech aspects of the crisis. But anybody's welcome. It's at 5 p.m. Eastern time, which means it's about 9 p.m. in a GMT. So that gives you a sense of the timing, and we hope you'll join us. I do this every day as long as we're hunkered down in New York City. Hopefully it'll be a few days and not multiple months. So please join us for that. And I will also be working on a conversation that I'm hosting on Monday night New York time with one of the world's leading experts in the world on the coronavirus, who will be joining us. Gerald Leung, Professor Leung, is from Hong Kong University, and we're doing a global conversation on that. And then finally, what I'm working on, along with Neil and several of our close friends, is on turning Social Media Weekend, which is coming up this Saturday, from an in-person event at Pace University into an online event online that you'll see. We're going to have Neil and Paula and Steve and others are going to help us take a conference that we could have easily postponed, but we didn't postpone because we believe there is a real need at this moment for people who want to learn how to see a professional conference run online and get a lot of information, practical stuff, because this too shall pass. That is the thing that gets us through all of this. So we need to keep building our skills and listening to great experts. And our closing speaker is going to be Nick Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn, the two of them who've written a book about the tough times Americans are going through called Tightrope. Hope you will order it. And Nick has been reporting and writing incessantly about the coronavirus. So you'll really enjoy that conversation. All the details of how this is going to work and how you can purchase a ticket if you haven't already, or if you already have a ticket, how you'll get access, all of that will be explained later today in emails, websites, etc. Please follow me at Sree, S-R-E-E, on Twitter, and you can email me sree@sree.net, sree@sree.net. I want to give a big shout out again to Neil, Paula, and Steve for having this wonderful online community that we've been able to build every Sunday morning. Please hit share right now on Facebook or on LinkedIn so your friends and family from around the world can participate. One of the things that gives me great comfort about being able to do Social Media Weekend online is because we've been online for the last 4+ years every Sunday and built a global community there. And thank you to all our viewers for watching and sticking with us for all these days, all these weeks, and now years as well. Thanks very much, Neil. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the exciting things is that we're actually going to bring Social Media Weekend online through StreamYard, the same app that we've been using for the New York Times Read Along for the last 4 months almost. So I'm excited about that. And Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, and Julia Weeks, who has helped with producing the show, will be helping next weekend as well. So it's going to be a great conference, and we'll share the details as soon as we have them.
Yep. So thanks, and have a great show. Look forward to watching, and thank you to Libby for joining us well. And please hit share right now and tell us how your Sunday is going.
And before you leave, I want to highlight, I shared some of where people are joining from, everywhere from Cambridge, Massachusetts, the East Village, Toronto, Philippines. Jennifer Dulles shared in particular, this is a welcome routine in these strange days. And I want to thank you, Jennifer, for those comments. I think we all feel the same about that. People joining from Chennai, from Senegal, Melbourne.
Wow.
It's just, it's an incredible community that you've built up, Sree, and that we've nurtured over time. And we will keep working on it.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll see you at 5 p.m. We'll see you 5 p.m. today, Eastern time.
Absolutely.
We do the tech COVID calls. And so Bob Anthony and I will be on that. And you can just listen on your phone. You don't need a computer or anything to listen, or you can go on the computer, uberconference.sreenet. Part of the thing we're talking about, you just mentioned StreamYard, is that we want to try different tools and not rely on only just one tool to do anything that we're going to do. So the more skills you can build up around these, the better off you're going to be if you're in the kind of work we do that's mostly remote.
Absolutely. So great. Well, thank you again, Sree, for joining us, and appreciate you'll be in the Facebook and LinkedIn live streams, interacting with people.
Yep.
And we'll get on with today's show. Lots to cover, of course. So thanks, Sree.
Thank you.
So, of course, that was Sree Srinivasan, host of the New York Times Read Along. It's always an honor and a pleasure for me to guest host, and I can't be more pleased to have Libby Copeland be our guest today. If this is the first time that you're watching, please let us know in the comments. Libby is I'm going to bring her on the screen right now. Libby, how are you?
Good. I'm good. I mean, you know.
Well, yes, that's the question, right?
Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for joining us. It was great seeing you last week when you were in DC for a book talk on the Lost Family, and we'll certainly be talking about that later. But for introductions for everyone, I can't tell you how proud I am to have you on the show and to see all the success you've been having with your book. For everyone else, Libby is a classmate of mine from Hastings High School,
Yeah.
Hastings on Hudson, New York, and we grew up together. It's just an incredible thrill to see all the great work and to have watched your work over the years with the Washington Post, Slate, Esquire, Atlantic, etc. But to have you on the show and to be able to share this with everyone,
it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
So we'll you saw there, a number of people watching, from some first-time watchers as well.
Yeah.
So me, Rose, and we have Janine watching from South Jersey and Philly. Tell us a little bit about yourself before. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say Somna Rose is one of the ASM artists that I follow.
Oh, great.
So yeah, I know who that is. I have to say, Neil, that seeing all these people from all around the world is making me feel better. I've been feeling really, anxious, and we've been in our house and seeing everyone together on this platform. It's like, it's reassuring to have all these people here in this virtual way. So it's kind of lovely. You've built something really, really great, you and Sri. So about myself. So I was a journalist at the Washington Post for 11 years, primarily as a reporter. And then I was also an editor. And I wrote about culture and politics and crime and a whole, the Olympics and politics, all sorts of things. And then I left the Post in 2010 to move to New York and start a family. And I'm a freelance journalist now, and I just write for a variety of places. Sometimes I do book reviews. Sometimes I write a lot about science, culture, human behavior, sort of like the intersection of those worlds. And as you mentioned, I just wrote a book about home DNA testing, which is science, culture, human behavior, all that stuff. So that's sort of my background. So.
Absolutely. So why don't we go ahead and talk about your book just for a little bit. We'll go into the paper and then come back and talk about some of your other work as well.
Sure. Yeah. So the book is called The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And it's a look at what I consider to be a really important social phenomenon, which is people using home DNA tests like 23andMe, like Ancestry, which cost $99 or less, to find their families, their genetic families. And in some cases, they get results that they weren't expecting that tell them that their genetic families aren't who they thought. So, for instance, that their father's not genetically related to them and somebody else is, or that they have a half sibling that they didn't know existed. And this has happened to a significant minority of people who do DNA testing. There's about 35 million people in the databases at this point through these companies.
And you tell me that there are probably 1 million people who've gotten unexpected results?
There's at least 1 million people who've had one, who either have discovered their father's not genetically related to them, or that they have a half sibling or sibling they didn't know about. But the universe of possibility is much bigger than that. You can learn, for instance, that you're adopted and you didn't know it. That's not that common, but it does happen. Most adoptees know at this point. You can learn that you have multiple half siblings. Perhaps you're donor conceived and you didn't know it, or you did know it, but you learned that you have upwards of 20 half siblings, or 50, or over 100. There are cases of people having between 100 and 200 half siblings that are documented. So there's a wide range of things you can discover, and I'm going with an extremely conservative estimate that at least 1 million people have discovered one of the two most common scenarios. But in fact, given the universe of possibility and the way that a single revelation affects all the members of a family, you're really talking about many millions of Americans profoundly affected by what's been termed recreational DNA testing. And it's usually framed as something, you just, spit into a tube or swab your cheek and you find out if you're, how Irish you are, or, where exactly, in, I don't know, Eastern Europe your roots are from, or where exactly in Africa your roots are from. And when you get your list of DNA relatives, sometimes the news that you get is more immediate and more life-changing than that.
Well, it's the question, even if there are a million unexpected results, the number of people that impacts, right, in a family, it's the immediate family, it's the family you didn't know you have and everyone there.
Right. It's siblings that are suddenly transformed into half siblings and the newly found half siblings you didn't know existed.
Yeah.
It's your aunt who's no longer genetically related to you, and now you're genetically related to a stranger, a bunch of strangers. It's in cases in which, there was maybe, say, marital infidelity, then it has impacts on the marriage. Implications for the woman who's married to the man who it turns out is your genetic father, or maybe it happened before they were married. There's all sorts of ways it plays out. And there's all sorts of ways it plays out in terms of how people connect with each other or don't. I talk in the book about all this sort of intimate stories of people affected by this. And I follow them on their journeys over the course of a year or more, how they're still processing the news and the way it really changes their sense of identity and their point of view about the world. There can be reunions where they're embraced, and there can be situations where they're shut out. So one genetic father, just deletes his test and, he's gone. He's not going to have a relationship with his genetic daughter.
Yeah.
So, there's really no way of, it's kind of a roulette wheel. You spin the wheel and you don't know what you're going to get. And it can be good, it can be bad, like it's nuanced and complicated, and it's never just good or bad. It's usually very complicated. But I just thought that it was important that we kind of look at this moment and start to study it, because I think we're really affecting a major change to American culture and to the way that the family operates and to the way, people see themselves, really.
And just I'll let Saurabh now and anyone else, please share this broadcast so other folks can watch on Facebook. You can just hit the share button, or you can tag your friends. Libby, hopefully you've had a chance to share it as well, if you can find it on your phone, and make sure all our friends from Hastings have a chance to watch.
Yeah.
Also want to give a shout out just in terms of Hastings connections. Don Pollard is a regular viewer of the show, a photographer. His son is a managing editor of The Buzzer, which is our high school newspaper, right? And Rochelle Philippak, my neighbor, is watching. My mom actually just got back from India this morning.
Oh my
She
God.
logged in earlier. So we have
that's such a treat.
Hastings in the house, if you will.
Saying hi to your mom.
I will. One of the questions that Mark Lee had, which I know you and I have talked about, the concern about DNA testing is really biased toward European samples.
Yeah.
Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a problem, and I do write about that. Both from the point of view of, sort of what's the history of genetic testing that makes basically these populations so white and European based, and also to what extent is this a business decision? Because the majority of people who do test they tend to be European American. And so that means that if you're testing and you're not from one of those populations, and particularly Latinx populations and African American populations tend to be less well represented. And so what that means is that they're not going to get the granular results that somebody else is if somebody else's DNA is from Sweden, for instance. So they'll get broadly, they might get something like broadly sub-Saharan African, or broadly West Africa, or something that sort of gives them a sense, because they may be able to get a kind of continent-wide prediction, but they're not going to get the specificity, and that's a real problem. And you'll see it's a problem in medical research too, because it makes us less good at understanding disease, because it's different in different populations, genetic predisposition for disease. And so you'll see certain companies like 23andMe trying to increase their reference populations for populations that aren't typically as well represented. And they've done outreach. They'll send free kits to people, and they're trying to get better. You do see that, but it's definitely been a problem.
And I put a banner on the screen, as you can see, asking people if they have used the testing service. We've also already had a few people share their comments on Facebook, and I'm going to go to that.
Yeah.
Our friend Pratnya from Silver Spring did do 23andMe. She discovered she's 100% South Asian, speaking to this issue of the lack of detail in the database.
Yeah.
But on a more serious note, and I want to honor Mark Lee and thank you for sharing that his dad recently found some family members trying to figure out whether to connect, how to connect, etc. This is something that came up. When you get a surprise result, this is serious business. It impacts people in very fundamental and core ways. What kind of help is available for people who are processing? Even Mark's question, trying to figure out how or whether to connect. What kind of counseling or what kind of support groups are there for people to figure this out?
Yeah, I wanted to know too. And the answer is there's not a lot in the way of formal support or research or guidance for folks. And it's almost like I feel like we're kind of behind on that, because, the phenomenon is happening. It's occurring to people. Every day there's lots and lots of people testing, and lots and lots of people finding that perhaps their families or they themselves are not who they thought. And what exists for them are essentially Facebook groups.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Facebook groups are amazing, and they exist for every kind of revelation you can get. Whether you find out, whether your donor conceived and you're searching for family, whether you're a foundling, which means somebody who was placed on a doorstep or abandoned and then found. That's the term for that. And then perhaps fostered or adopted. So those groups are great. And the genetic genealogists, who in many cases have started them, have done an incredible service. But when you look at what there is formally, there's really not much, which is fairly astonishing given the number of people that exist who are dealing with this. I mean, the major companies put kind of warnings on their websites when you test. They'll say, because this is common enough, they'll say, you may find out unexpected things about your family. 23andMe has a link to. They mentioned that if you need help, you can use an online therapy app like BetterHelp and Talkspace.
Sure.
But as far as formal, there's very little. So there's a group called NPE Friends Fellowship. And an NPE, by the way, used to stand for non-paternity event, which meant that your dad wasn't genetically related to you. Now it stands for not parent expected, to recognize that it can be basically either parent isn't genetically related to you. So there's this group that has been formed that's like a nonprofit that's trying to, sort of look into these issues and offer support. There's a few psychologists that I found who are starting to specialize in this. Actually, the kind of trauma that takes place when you suddenly find your identity, kind of there's a sense of displacement and disorientation for people. If you're 50 years old and you have this sense that you know what the deal is with your family, and then you test and perhaps you haven't been told everything. Perhaps you feel betrayed. There's all this sort of emotion that comes with it. It can be bittersweet. It can be heartwarming. It's complicated. It's very complicated. And people process this for the rest of their lives. So there's a couple of psychologists I found. There's a genetic counselor named Brianne Kirkpatrick who specializes in DNA surprises. But I really think that in a few years, this is going to be like a subspecialty. This is common enough at this point that, you'll see psychologists will specialize in anxiety and PTSD and, and all the different things. And one of the subspecialties will be like sudden DNA revelations or DNA surprises. So yeah, I mean, I hope that there will be more in the future. I really do.
Our friend Deborah Bernick found a second cousin and asked if we knew if her dad was still alive. Divorce had separated them years ago. Linda Lawrence said took a DNA test, which resulted in learning about and connecting with several third cousins.
It can be really
and it's not always. I mean, you would hope that sometimes it would work out, that there would be a positive experience for people reconnecting, etc. And so it's not always traumatic.
No, and I mean, I have to say, even in the cases where there is a traumatic outcome, the vast majority of people told me they were glad to know. So that's interesting.
And you're still happy to know, certainly.
They were happy to know because the truth has an inherent value, But yeah, I mean, our family, for instance, tested and found results like Linda was talking about, where we found second cousin through both my mother's and father's side we wouldn't have known existed. One born in Ukraine, one living in Sweden. And there's this incredible access to the past. I mean, it's DNA testing. What it can open up is truly amazing in terms of its immediacy, your immediate access to, maybe ancestors who came over to the U.S. a few generations ago. So
Sure.
that can be pretty. It can be pretty cool, I have to say, too.
What's interesting, Susan Kuznetsky said that she hasn't done the testing because she assumed it would be a broad Eastern European classification. I think that, with the increase in the number of data sets they have, I think what you told me was that they're getting more specific by the day, right, in terms of the results that you're getting.
Yeah, so when you test, you'll find that you'll get slightly different results depending on the company, and that's because each company uses its own reference population and its own algorithm. And so some companies may have a much more robust and large reference population for Poland, for instance, and they have different terminologies for it too, because even that can be complicated. But you may find you test somewhere and they say you're 13% XYZ, and then somebody else, other company says you're 20% XYZ, and it's like, what does that mean? And it's it's an evolving science, and each company has its own formula for parsing it. On the other hand, if you get a list of genetic relatives, those people are, with a handful of exceptions, almost always as closely related to you as it indicates. And so that's a different kind of way of parsing the numbers, and that is extremely reliable.
Our friend Laura Silverman, who was a former guest on the show, and will certainly, if we do get to the other articles that you've written that we wanted to talk about, the one about the school shooting in Ohio, the long-term impacts of that. Laura did some great work after Parkland, creating these postcards of the victims of the shooting there, called Portraits of Parkland. But she was sharing that she had heard of someone from Liverpool whose dad was an American soldier who had left and lost contact with the family. The person was raised by their white English mother, and through testing found relatives in Philadelphia and is connected with people. There are a number of other stories like that.
It really makes it smaller in many ways. I have to say, DNA testing makes the world smaller.
Sure. So I want to call in the first of several Hastings high school classmates with some comments. If you remember Mary Rose, Mary, so glad you're joining us today. Mary was in my class. But she's asking, have you examined what people are lacking in their own sense of identity that they choose to pursue this kind of testing? In medicine, we make sure they have mental health support, because when we refer, they probably will find a medical diagnosis that takes processing. That's not just the counseling around the family issues, but the genetic kind of offshoot of that, the testing. that comes.
There's a bioethicist who told me, and I quote him saying, when people test for medical purposes, they know to be worried. But when they test for recreational purposes, they're almost always not expecting anything that they need to worry about. Even if like the statistics say that some people will get a surprise on their results, like you generally assume that it won't be you, because you assume that there is to know about their family. But I would push back on the idea that there's something lacking in people's sense of identity. I mean, there are cases where people go looking because they know, I don't know my dad's identity, so let me find out through testing for sure. But a lot of people are, curious. Maybe their great grandparents came to the U.S. and assimilated the way so many Americans do, and have been encouraged to, decades ago, and they don't even know where they come from, and they're searching for that connection. We always heard this great grandparent was Italian, and but like, what does that mean? And maybe we want to go to Italy. Maybe we want to figure out where he came from. And so that's some of it's like this idle curiosity, and often it's like a gift that's given at the holidays. The gift that you get for somebody who already has everything. So yeah, that's
and some more great stories. Janine Nolan, guys, potentially I don't recognize the name, so hopefully a first-time viewer. Thank you for joining us, or maybe Janine has been watching but not commenting lately. But her mother was able to answer questions about why her father was a foster child, and what his last name was, and it just incredible the number of stories that are coming out. Therese Steiner is sharing that she had a friend who found out his biological father was a sperm donor, and another who donated sperm in graduate school had been contacted by biological children. Right, that's a fairly common.
Yeah, I mean, historically, the fertility banks many of them have promised anonymity to sperm donors, and that was a realistic promise decades ago, and now it is not. And so, effectively, the era of anonymity for sperm donors is over. It just is. Even if you, as the donor, never test, even if you never spit into a vial or swab your cheek, it doesn't matter. You can still be found through genetic genealogy techniques. And just to hit on the person who posted previously, her point was that it's not just the DNA that gives you a sense of your roots, it's also the genealogy work. So a lot of genetic genealogists will say, like, you have to use traditional genealogy and other techniques to really understand what the information is, because otherwise you just have this list of people, of DNA relatives, and you're like, who are all these people?
And so I want to thank Janine for sharing that comment, and really point out the power of this conversation, Libby. Janine is a regular viewer, but usually quiet, and this inspired her to share something. Shout out to our friend Anna. Hi Anna, so glad that you're watching from Dobbs Ferry. Grew up with us in Hastings, and I want to. Also, let's see, a couple of other comments. Terry Ann Thompson, who is joining us, discovered that she's not Native American, had been told her whole life that her great-grandma was a member of a Midwestern tribe. So those are the kinds of things where it changes what you thought you knew about yourself, and how how you interact with the world.
Yeah, your relationship on the world changes, and your relationship to truth can change too. I mean, maybe not with something like that, but with bigger things, you start to wonder, gosh, who am I, and what was I told all my life for 50 years? It's disorienting.
Jeff is sharing that the match with a number of first cousins, also matched written genealogy going back to the 1600s. One of the things you mentioned, though, Libby, is that there is the connection in terms of the data sets that are out there. They can draw connections out to the third cousin level.
Further, yeah.
Further than that. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So when you get your list of DNA relatives, you'll get you'll get your child, if your child's in the database, your parent, you'll get aunts, grandparents, if they're in there. You'll get first, second, third, fourth cousins. You may get something that's like third to fifth cousin or more distant. Like, it kind of can't make a prediction on that granular level. But what they've generally found is that so they have genetic genealogists and search angels, who are people who help people find their genetic kin, who've been doing a lot of work on behalf of adoptees for many, many years, have found that they can generally identify somebody based on triangulating DNA down to a third cousin level, with some difficulty depending on the size of the database. So that means that if in the case of the Golden State Killer, that serial killer, alleged serial killer's DNA, he never tested at Ancestry, but they used his crime scene DNA and put it in there. And through third cousins and sometimes even more distant cousins, it has been shown you can do this. But using like third cousins, for instance, they could figure out his identity, even though he was not in the database. Does that make sense? So even if you have enough third cousins, or better yet, second and first cousins, you can basically build back your tree, your family tree, and figure out the common ancestors, most recent common ancestors, and then come back down through time using social media, Facebook,
Wow.
present day descendants. And a lot of that has to do not with DNA, but with like the magic of social media and the internet, right? Like we all have a trail now.
Sure.
And then once you've figured out all the present day descendants, you can start to figure out who among those descendants is your likely, in this case, your likely culprit for a crime. But it's the same principle that you use to help someone find their genetic father or genetic mother. Is you look at their third, so say an adoptee test and they're in the system, but they don't know their genetic mother and father. You could use their third cousins, if you have a number of them, to go back up and then climb back down.
So I want to give a quick shout out to our friends watching on LinkedIn as well. One of the things with the StreamYard app that we're using to produce the show, and that we push it to both Facebook and LinkedIn at the same time, we can see the comments coming in from Facebook, and that's what I've been showing on the screen. But the comments on LinkedIn, they don't connect with the app. So we manually have to bring them in. And Steve Taylor, our LinkedIn producer, flags them for us. Lisa Chow was asking, did you learn any surprising from your own results? Or from results of the test or results of the research?
Yeah, so I didn't learn anything that was surprising in my immediate circle. But I think I mentioned we found a second cousin through my dad's side. We would not have known this person existed. This person lives in Sweden. And her daughter is a genealogist, which is like amazing, totally amazing, because she'd done all this research and she was in the database. A lot of people in Sweden are not. She happened to be. And so we found this second cousin, which was this we found this woman, and then her mother was my dad's second cousin. And that is, so my dad's grandmother came over from Sweden in the 1890s. So think about the immediacy of being able to meet a living person, right? A second cousin, and that person's link to you goes back that far. It's like the past isn't that far away at all. And we actually took a family trip and we went to Sweden and we met her. And it was astonishing, because, you think about all the different ways your life could have played out if our ancestor had stayed there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's an option. And they did stay. And then through my mother's side, we were able to find a close cousin whose branch of the family stayed behind in Ukraine, apparently surviving pogroms in World War II in the USSR. Because he was born in Ukraine, then moved to Israel and came to New York. Wow. That was like amazing. That was a branch of the family we did not know existed. And we certainly, wouldn't have assumed survived. That was astonishing.
It is. I think that another comment that I want to bring in from LinkedIn, which I think is interesting. Victoria Zunich is sharing that she'd caution people against accepting DNA tests over family stories, and not necessarily caution them at the test. I would think that you have to take them both. I think it was Terry that mentioned that she had a grandmother who was Native American. The rest of Victoria's comment, it's too long to fit in our box, unfortunately. But her grandmother may have lived as and believed she was a Native American, and that doesn't take away from the culture, that you're raised in and kind of what your experience is. So that's another interesting facet as well.
Broader point is that the danger that people worry about is that you suddenly elevate your genes over your experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that most people do that. I think they're pretty careful about it. But some of the marketing around it, you see, I thought it was one thing, then I swabbed my cheek and I found out I was something else, and now I'm this other thing.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, if you're raised with a certain cultural affinity or cultural identity, like that is real. And maybe we all identify more with some, at least to the extent that you're kind of an American mutt like me, you identify with some pieces of your culture more than others. Certain things get highlighted. You just kind of like, it speaks to you more, and that's normal. And I think that's totally 100% valid. That genetic ethnicity and identification are, or cultural ethnicity are not the same thing.
And so I'm sharing a couple of other comments that people have shared. Claudia was sharing that they had done a New York Times swab. Interviewing for the New York Times, did a swab of her cheek. I'll bring that comment back up. And found that there was some common ancestors going back a few years, prehistoric humans, I guess. Our friend Carla Baranakis, another former guest and a former staff person at the New York Times, used 23andMe for medical reasons, and they had some expected results. But it's interesting that people had different concerns about whether or not to do the testing and sharing DNA, et cetera.
When you're doing medical testing, there's clearly issues having to do with, do I want to know about certain diseases that maybe I can't do anything about, or that may cause me anxiety, or so there's medical, and there's also privacy concerns for people having to do with commercial DNA testing. And so a lot of people do opt out. One of the prominent genetic genealogists in the field, a woman named Cece Moore, told me, that she used to, people would come up to her conferences and they would say, I'm trying to trace back my colonial line back to England. And if only this one cousin would test, I'd be able to figure it out. How do I persuade them? And she says she used to help them try to figure it out. And now she says, don't honor that because, because if you don't want to test, there may be very good reasons. And, both as an ethical matter and as a question of the reputation of the field of genetic genealogy, she didn't want people being pressured into doing DNA testing.
And our friend Susan had shared earlier that her husband would be a good candidate for DNA testing. Before we move on, this has been a fascinating discussion. We want to cover some of the paper as well, and also talk about kind of your thoughts about coronavirus, novel coronavirus, COVID-19. But I just want to remind folks that, as Paula shared, Ingy had a question. We're using StreamYard to produce the show to both Facebook and LinkedIn. That's what allows us to do the banners, to bring in guests remotely very easily, to have the graphics on the screen. And if you're interested in learning more about how to use StreamYard, particularly now that people are working from home and looking for ways to connect online to deliver content, I'd be more than happy to help walk people through it. So feel free to reach out. My email is neil@neilparekh.org. We've loved using StreamYard, and again, we'll be using StreamYard to move our social media weekend conference from an in-person conference to an online event next Saturday. We'll be sharing details about that shortly in the later today or tomorrow. Let's move on to the paper. There are a lot of great comments that have come in. A lot of people who are contending with this issue, and I certainly want to echo Janine's comments that this has been a great discussion. But let's turn our attention to the paper, because this has been a really challenging news week, and there's a lot to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my camera and go to the newspaper. And so hopefully we still have audio and we don't have any echoes. The front page of the paper, folks, at 9:15, we'll talk about what's in the New York Times. The display story today, and Libby, I know that you've had a chance to review this. Two women fell sick, only one recovered, both mothers from Wuhan, both medical professionals who worked on the front lines. Certainly, as you're looking at the paper, just one of the things that we try and educate people about, the lead is always the top right corner. This is about Europe locks up and faces crises as the virus spreads. Italy and Spain and France are restricting public life. Hoboken, New Jersey, as well, is closing bars, restaurants, etc. But the display story, the one with the dominant picture, is this one about the medical professionals. What did you pick up from that story, Libby?
I read that story this morning with a mounting sense of anxiety in the pit of my stomach. It's about two 29-year-old young mothers who are medical professionals who both come down with, they're living in China. They both come down with the coronavirus, and one lives and one doesn't. And, as you're reading it, you're becoming invested in these women. And so part of the anxiety is just knowing that one of them is going to die. And, that the symptoms that would predict the seriousness of the disease aren't necessarily consistent with what happens. And that's one of the scariest things that, we've been hearing about. Just last night, I was reading about, people quarantining at home if they have the disease, and then needing to have access to emergency services because you can suddenly crash. In fact, this was on listening to an episode of The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast, their excellent podcast. They were talking about the possibility of suddenly crashing. So you can kind of be going along and, suddenly not be doing well at all, have seemingly mild symptoms and then not. And also in some cases make a recovery from what seems like it's going to be a mortal affliction. I mean, the other piece that's really just, brought up a lot of stuff for me was just, we tend to think that this is something that just afflicts the elderly, which doesn't make it any less important. But I think there's a sense among young people of kind of indomitability. And here's the story of two 29-year-olds who were infected, both very, very seriously. One of them dies. And it makes clear that we are all vulnerable. And truly, we all have to protect each other because we don't know who's vulnerable, and just because that's the right thing to do.
Well, the up till now, and I think one of the earlier stats that I'd seen, this goes back at least a week, if not longer, that the mortality rate was fairly low for the general population for younger groups, but as high as 15% for people over 80, and that certainly worried me. And this is very personal for a lot of us.
Yeah.
My mom just came back from India. She landed today and is home. But she had to travel through the airport and through the plane. Not certain what that experience would have been like. You're in your basement today instead of at your mom's house because you didn't want to take that chance.
Yeah.
And what we're finding.
Yeah,
we're finding in France and Italy that half of the cases are actually people who are younger, not older. in the face of the reports that people are crowding into bars and restaurants and going out, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they could be endangering their loved ones.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, France, the other story that's, I think, the lead story, so top to the right, talks about, I believe it's that story that talks about France shutting down its bars and restaurants,
Yep.
which seems like a necessity at this point. And I'm just thinking about how not that long ago I was reading or listening to a story about, a debate over whether those heat lamps that are used outside in French cafes were environmentally, like, they're not environmentally great, and should they get rid of them? Yes, they encourage a great sort of nightlife and social. They allow smokers to be outside and all this stuff, but they're so bad for the environment. And should they be considering a ban? And that was like 2.5 weeks ago. And the whole concept of coronavirus, everything has changed so much, even between yesterday and today. And now we're talking about the cafes are shut down. It's just amazing to me how much can change in such a short amount of time. I don't know if it's like this for other people, but I feel like every day I have to reorient myself. And it's taken a while to kind of sink into the seriousness of this. And I don't think I'm the only one. To really, my kids were in school on Friday, and now we're not doing any play dates at all or anything. So
let's talk about how it's affecting us personally, and if folks who are watching want to share in the comments what their thoughts are, even if they want to keep it simple. And I saw someone post on Facebook. What is their level of concern from 0 to 10 right now? 0 being not concerned at all, and 10 being this is the I don't know what the top of the scale would be, Libby, in terms of an extreme anxiety, end of the world type thing. Not so much end of the world, but just at what level are you really worried? To bring it home, to make it personal, and I'll flip the camera around for just a second. So Emily, my daughter is 7. They had planned, Fairfax County Schools had planned on closing on Monday to give teachers a chance to learn how to do distance learning. And then at the last minute, they said they're going to close Friday and keep schools closed until April 13th.
Wow.
And we found out last night that a staff person at the elementary school nearby tested positive. My first thought is, okay, does that person interact with staff at our elementary school? How close is this to being exposed? You have 2 weeks of exposure before you have a positive test. A close friend of ours, so close friend, kind of a friend of a friend, but someone that we've hung out with, that we've seen at parties, is about 30 years old and tested positive, is with pneumonia in the hospital. He's a sound technician. All of his gigs through May have been canceled.
I mean, I think the point is that many of us have it and we don't know it. I mean, that you're mentioning the teacher who works at the school. I mean, I think in our community, I think there are a lot of people who have it. They may not have any symptoms, or they may have very mild symptoms, or their symptoms may not have shown up yet. But I think we have to act as if people in our communities have it. At least here, where I'm in Westchester County, New York, we're 20 minutes from the containment zone. I know of multiple people who are quarantining in the midst of being tested. And obviously there are cases of people I don't know personally who are infected.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of them. So yeah, we have to start acting as if it's already here.
I think we have to. And I think Mary is sharing, it's a hard time to be a medical professional. The elderly are vulnerable. The coronavirus has been more more impactful. Yet the practice of hoarding and supplies is a detriment, and that's a real good segue to this other story that's on the front page. This person who
Yes.
went around after the first news broke, drove around the state looking for hand sanitizer, cleaning supplies with a U-Haul, and tried to sell them on Amazon, and Amazon eventually shut him down.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. But if you look at the front page, and there is a story about coronavirus, a couple of leads to stories, uninvited guests at Mar-a-Lago, Trump's reference to the Google project that is not really fully baked yet, health systems overwhelmed, this hoarder, one story about the president's imprint on the courts is not coronavirus on the front page of the paper.
Yeah.
To follow up on Mary's point, and I'm not sure if it's going to be in print today. I'm going to take a look for it. Here you can see coronavirus update, and we talk about dominating the front page. Sorry, not the front page, but this inside page in the paper. This is focusing as China tries to stifle coverage, defiant journalists do exposés. There are a number of health professionals that are on the front lines, but we also want to give a shout out to all the journalists out there that are covering this story and are doing what they can to produce the paper, to report the news, to produce TV shows, even with smaller staffs. I know CBS News has a smaller staff because they have several people who have the virus on staff there. But you can see here's the inside pages on the two women fell sick story, which is just heartbreaking. And day 17 after hospitalization, a little write up, and then day 35, it was when someone passed away. Just page after page. And I think this is only going to get the virus is going to get worse. The coverage is going to get more saturated. I remember after 9/11, and people are comparing this to 9/11 to Hurricane Katrina, these kinds of seminal moments in history. I remember thinking about how many days in a row was 9/11 the dominant story on the front page, right? It must have been at least 3 weeks, 4 weeks before anything else was on the front page, much less not being the lead. But you see all of this coverage, still commuting only days. It's by bicycle, by car, and foot.
Yeah.
New York hospitals cancel surgeries and ask retired nurses to return. I don't see this in the paper, so I'm going to go to online. Because Mary was joining us as a health professional, there's a feature that I want to show our viewers, and we can show it because of the magic of StreamYard. So we'll just take a look at, this is the feature. I just want to make sure I have the right page up for folks, and then it's loading. So let's go here. So I'm going to share my screen. The workers who face the greatest coronavirus threat, which is just incredible. If you follow this story, and make sure that we're showing it on the screen. Yep. It's the health professionals. You look at dentists, paramedics.
Oh yeah.
Personal care. It's looking at exposure to disease on the left and their proximity to people on the right. And healthcare workers are at greatest risk. They can encounter diseases and infections daily and typically work in close proximity. Dentists, paramedics, nurses, home health aides. Our neighbor is a dental hygienist. I worry about her.
Yeah.
personal care aides. I used to work with a union in Washington State representing home care workers. They themselves are older and have are not in great health, and they're working with people who are exposed, potentially exposed. The nursing home in Washington State, an epicenter of the outbreak, 70 employees have fallen sick. These are the kinds of people that our union represented when I worked out there. First responders, and school systems also. Yes. Teacher assistants, elementary school teachers. Yeah. It is a lot to take in and a lot to consider.
Yeah. That's a great. Was this in today's paper, or was that?
See, I didn't see it in the print edition yet, but I saw it online, and that's one of the things that we try and do. The New York Times Read Along is a celebration of print. Shri has been doing this. This is the 5th year that Shri has been hosting the Sunday New York Times Read Along, and he started it to honor print and to look at, just to share what's special about print. Usually when you're online, you go right to the story that you're interested in. You follow a link, you look at sections that you know. The New York Times, the print edition leads to serendipity. You flip the pages and you get drawn into an article by its caption, by a graph, etc. But especially with the use of this app with StreamYard, when we can show things online, we try and do that. There's some things that do pop that are better online, and one of the things in terms of news, of course, the news is dated once it comes off the printing press, right? So one of the breaking news items from this morning that I was sharing with you before we started is that the Pope canceled all public festivities associated with Holy Week. That was just an hour before we started. So there is a lot to consider with all of this.
So I just want to make a bid. I don't know if you're able to bring this up, but the Nick Kristof column from today.
Which one? The Nick Kristof one?
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I'll sort of just talk about it while you're getting it up. Sure. This is worth reading, I think, for everyone, because what he does, what he and the folks who work with him on this column do, is they create a graph that makes a prediction about infections and deaths based on 2 key factors: the aggressiveness of the intervention, so the degree to which we all participate in aggressive social distancing and other and widespread testing, which is the other thing that's predicated on, over which we have no control. That has to do with issues of having tests available, which we hope will happen soon. And also when you start to intervene. And I was thinking about this in light of the news that I think the UK still hasn't banned large events. And that was in this lead story today, and I thought, I hope they do soon, because he shows how early intervention really makes a difference. I mean, even a few weeks of aggressive measures like widespread testing and aggressive social distancing, starting now versus starting a month from now, you can just see the deaths go down.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking for that article right now. I remember seeing the graphs, and that you can use sliders. It was some really great research. I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, Paula, as we're watching, if you can find this article by Nick Kristof and send it to me by WhatsApp, I would appreciate it. That would make it a little bit easier. It's a piece that has sliders that you can show the impact. If you do early interventions, you can bring down the number of cases. Another pro tip, again, as we do the read along, we also try and explain to people how we do what we do. It's absolutely critical to have a team of people helping you. Even when Shri was doing this alone on Facebook, I used to produce the show for him, dropping in links, etc. And what we do is we use WhatsApp to communicate with each other during the show, because that will give you a message on top of your browser window. So I can share notes with Shri when he is doing the show. Paula and I can talk to each other. Steve Taylor can talk to each other. So that's just another tip that we share with folks. And again, a big shout out to our production team with Paula Geiger. You can find her at Big Green Pen, and Steve Taylor at Steve DeReeve on all platforms. A couple of other comments that I want to get to as we were looking at the paper that came in. And scrolling back up, my mom actually had mentioned she had been traveling from India. People were anxious and scared. Everyone was wearing masks, and they were taking people's temperature and checking. And she had to carry a doctor's certificate because she has chronic bronchitis. And she had to let people know that this is just a regular cough, nothing worse than that.
Yeah.
Our friend Carla is recovering from hip surgery, and she's concerned about their hosts going to the visiting nurse, etc. It is really, challenging. Mark Lee is talking about a friend who works for DoorDash, and it's definitely impacting his gig job.
I mean,
a number of people
who don't get paid sick leave because, if you work a gig job or you don't get paid sick leave, which is the majority of Americans. Actually, the editorial board has a today.
I was going there actually.
Yeah, calling for paid sick leave. But what you're essentially doing is you're encouraging people, you're forcing them, if they want to get paid, to come in and work. And these are the people who may be serving your food, preparing your food, delivering it to you, driving you around in a cab, whatever. It matters for them, and it matters for us. It matters for everyone.
And this is the editorial that you referenced, opposing paid sick leave risk lives. And it's looking at the estimated number of workers without access to paid sick leave in the retail, food, hospitality, and grocery industries. McDonald's workers, Walmart, 517,000, 347,000, Subway, Kroger, Pizza Hut, Burger King, Target. These are just some of the larger ones. This is the Nick Kristof column in print, doing little or doing more looks like this. And I do have the link, so I'm going to show it to you in a moment. The difference that interventions make. Early intervention would make a big difference in terms of the infection rate and the mortality rate. Let's go to that article real quick. And I think one of the things that is great about journalism and being able to do the data visualization, it really does bring it home for people. So let's go to this chart right here. So this is the article. They're talking about the impact of coronavirus. Just clear that from the screen. So you could have 9.4 million infections at its peak in July. That's what the estimate is. 1 million total deaths.
This
but
is the United States.
That's if we stay on the current track, right?
Right. This is the U.S.
This is the U.S. But interventions matter greatly. If we have interventions start, I'm not sure when that would be on the graph before July. If we delay interventions.
Yeah, keep sliding down. It'll give you to the slider option. It shows you how early interventions make a difference and how the degree of intervention, those are choices, mild, moderate, and aggressive. And then I think if you keep scrolling a little bit more, oh my gosh.
You get to play with it.
Yeah, you can play with it, but there is an option to play with the slider, and you can move it from what's today, March 15th. You can move it from here, and you can move it forward. And you really see how as you move the point of intervention forward, there are more. Yeah.
So let's see. So you can drag the intervention.
Mhm.
If you wait until July,
Yeah, look at that.
this is how high it would be, right?
Right.
If you do no interventions, effectively.
Right.
We're at today, so this is the closest we could get to social distancing. Really, just everyone should just stay home. I mean, that's the message that I've been hearing, and that we're gonna do. I was at the grocery store last night. We might make one more run, but that may be it for a while. And then the level of intervention is also
Right.
If you do aggressive interventions now, look at the difference that makes.
Right. Right. And they define aggressive intervention as, I think, as social distancing and also widespread testing.
Widespread testing, ending large gatherings, et cetera. And I think that the other thing to consider it's the impact on the healthcare system that we have to worry about.
Yes.
If we can slow the growth, the healthcare system would be able to handle it.
Right.
If the volume is too high, then ICUs would be overwhelmed.
Right.
And that's the other
number of ill people spaced out over 18 months versus, a month and a half. He makes the point. They're going to have more deaths if it's all condensed, because then you're talking about more people competing for the same resources and people who are sick for unrelated reasons not being able to access their needed health care.
And I'm just looking through the comments. Our friend Stephen Kaplan, we did a great show with him at the Museum of the City of New York back in December. A great photographer, visual consultant as well. Amazed that we haven't seen more coverage about how this is going to affect people who are experiencing homelessness or living in shelters. And I don't know that I've seen a lot of work about that. Wayne Camadoy, who works at the Times in production, have produced dozens of pages this week, primarily from their homes. It hasn't been easy, and everyone's been learning to work remotely. Wayne, thank you for all the work that you and your colleagues are doing. We had a great session. We were at Tom Jolly's house last summer, the print editor of the New York Times, and that opened the doors for Shri to do a walkthrough of the New York Times printing plant at College Point to be able to see how that works. I'd seen the reports that the New York Times was moving to have everyone work remotely, but at the same time, and Wayne, if you can maybe share in the comments, I assume that you need to have at least a skeleton crew to run the printing presses, essential workers, if you will. If you could share anything about that, we definitely would love to hear more about that. But yeah, this is certainly what everyone is talking about and what everyone is grappling with. It's interesting to look at it from the perspective of news and what the different angles are. So the other major story, looking at the business section, I think is really, really telling. So let's take a look at that real quick. We have the front page. It's, obviously a rendition of George Washington from the dollar bill, but the headline, "Your Money and the Coronavirus: What the Pandemic Means for Your Portfolio, Your Wallet, Your House, and Your Sanity." It's every section really can find a way to relate to this story. Libby, your focus has been on science and culture as a journalist. What kind of stories are really resonating with you that you've seen, or if you were still writing for the Post, what do you think you would be writing about, or what would you be asking your editor to go do enterprise stories on?
I mean, I'm very interested in this kind of the human behavior aspect of it, like what causes us to alter our behavior and what messaging is necessary to kind of break through. Because as I mentioned earlier, I feel like it's taken me a while to come around to this point of understanding the gravity of the situation. And I know I'm not alone, because sometimes the messaging is a little confusing. Your kids are still in school, but you're being told to avoid large gatherings. And there are good reasons why the schools have remained open in certain parts for for a variety of reasons. But it can be a little bit confusing to really wrap your head around it. When I think about how I was thinking about all of this a week ago, I was not anywhere near understanding this, right? And we know that time is of the essence in terms of in terms of saving lives. So if there are people elsewhere in the country who are where we were a few weeks ago in terms of feeling kind of remote from this, and that this was something that was happening elsewhere and we didn't need to worry about it, I guess I would be interested in looking at some work around, maybe what social psychologists have to say about the messaging about this. What kind of messaging does it take to have it sink in? Is it a question of proximity? Is it trusted? Is it trusted people telling you? Is it CDC advisories? Like, how does news kind of a situation of a pandemic filter through a population and get to the point where people are willing to make the very radical step of keeping themselves in their homes, essentially, and when are they going to be there elsewhere? Like, when, I think, did you say Hoboken has shut down all its?
Yeah, Hoboken made an announcement that they are asking the restaurants and bars to close.
Like, is that going to happen in New York City? Could that happen? When will that?
Could that happen?
Happen in France?
Should it happen? Yes.
Should it happen? And if it should happen a week from now, should it happen now? I'm not saying, I'm certainly not an epidemiologist, and I'm not saying it should, but I'm just wondering, like, what is it that a week from now is going to seem obvious to us? That we're going to be like, oh, why didn't we do that a week ago? Because, X people's number of lives would have been saved.
Sure. I want to thank Wayne for the update, really shouting out. And I was wondering about this myself. Home deliverers and the staff at College Point are the ones that are keeping the paper coming out and at our doorsteps. And, being in Virginia, it was occurring to me, I mean, if I had to go out and get the paper, I could nearby. But this is a lifeline for folks, right? If they're getting the paper, at some point, that may be impacted as well.
Also, the people who are delivering food to people's doors.
People
are not going to the supermarket anymore. Up by me, our local grocery store is delivering. All those people working in the grocery stores delivering the food.
Yeah. It's. Mark raised a good question earlier as well. I'm curious to what prisons are doing, and how they're handling this. Janine shared that a prison in Delaware County has 11 inmates in isolation after one employee tested positive. Others are in self-isolation. It is certainly what everyone is thinking and talking about. I do want to make reference to some of the other work that you've done, Libby, and I want to be able to share. I know that Paula and Steve have links to these articles. You've done some great work around a range of issues. I, in particular, was interested in the ASMR articles that you had done.
Urban politeness.
Right, to change the focus just a little bit. There was an article about the school shooting in Ohio, the long-term impacts on a community. There was an article about raccoons, how this backs to your science focus, and how they are evolving and actually smarter than we realize. And personally, the article, you wrote a book review about someone who was a man who was raped, and how that might change the way we talk about these things. That's an issue that we've talked about several times on the Read Along. Abigail Pesta wrote a book about the girls, about the women who were abused by that doctor in Michigan who abused the gymnasts on the U.S. Gymnastics team. I take great pains not to mention his name because I don't want to honor him in that way. But we also have the judge in that case, Judge Rosemary Aquilina, is going to be joining us April 19th on the New York Times Read Along and talking about her work. So we'll have Abigail join us again, and that'll be ahead of Denim Day, which is a day in April, which is part of National Sexual Assault Awareness Month, for people to show their support for survivors of sexual assault. So those are just some of the things that we're working on long term, and I want to at least reference the work that you've done. I think that it's a fascinating background, a fascinating range of articles, and this is the kind of thing that this story takes up all the space in the room, and even with that, there are other things that we can share. One of the things that I would like to bring in as we're talking about folks is the New York Times Magazine. They do a great job. They do this is the 25 songs that they're focusing on this week. So I'm going to take a moment. We're going to shift gears, but I want to show the behind the scenes of the cover because I think that's always a really interesting piece. And I'm being mindful of time. We do our best to finish at 10 a.m. So I'm going to sneak in the New York Times Magazine kind of behind the scenes video. So let's go to that. And just have to find it. Bear with me one moment. There we go. Thank you for your patience and for bearing with us. But here is behind the cover from the New York Times Magazine. Whoops.
There's a number of profiles in there, I think. There's a Billie Eilish profile.
Looks like it's just taking a little bit longer to load than I was expecting.
So that looks like her. You can recognize her by the hair.
Exactly. Let's go ahead and watch that. I might just have too many tabs open, and there we go.
From the New York Times Magazine, this is Behind the Cover.
This week we have our annual music issue where we choose 25 songs that help define where music is at right now. It's always an opportunity to shoot a bunch of great photography and be really inventive with the design, and this year is no different.
Our photo department was really excited to work with Ariel Bob Willis, who is a young emerging photographer. She has a really unique, vibrant color palette and also choreographs the body in unusual ways.
Mm-hmm.
She photographed the musicians using only natural light on the streets and rooftops of LA.
We ended up with 3 artists for the cover.
Yes.
Megan Thee Stallion, Lil Nas X, and Billie Eilish. The really strong energy of Ariel's photographs, they created a mood the design picks up on in a lot of ways.
Yeah, this issue every year has a lot of energy in terms of its design. We're often responding to music and the fluidity of it.
Totally.
It gives us a lot of opportunities to make something unconventional.
So that's just a little bit of the background of that cover. Some comments that came in. Mark shared that raccoons are very smart. That they had a pet raccoon named Bandit, and we had Mark also asked a question about what sports are going on, which I think is interesting because we actually don't usually cover sports in the New York Times read along because we have such a global audience. It's not as relevant for everyone. But the New York Times sports section, looking at is this the end of the high five? Facing a world without our games, with the NBA, the Major League Baseball, NHL all canceling their seasons, suspending their seasons. It is really impacting every facet of society. What are you seeing in Hastings, Libby? What kind of are any activities still going on, or is everything canceled?
Everything is canceled.
Yeah.
I think that there may still be Board of Trustees meetings going on. I'm not sure. That may be the only one. I'm not sure if they're happening remotely or not. But
that kind of thing can happen remotely. I mean, you can do Board of Trustees meetings and school board meetings and live stream them. With Zoom, one of the things that I know Zoom has done is extended their professional level tier of service to schools,
right?
K through 12 schools, so they can use them.
So
whether you
right.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say at the moment, what we're waiting to find out is whether the schools are going to close. The schools have closed Monday and Tuesday of this coming week, but we have not heard what's going to happen beyond that. And meanwhile, we're hearing from many other people elsewhere that their schools are closing. So we're expecting there to be a closure, but we don't know yet. And the kids have been given Chromebooks, those who needed them, to to do their lessons online. I mean, nobody knows how this is going to play out. Nobody knows exactly how this will work. But we're all just feeling our way.
I'm just flipping through the magazine, some of the great design work that they did for this special music issue. With the color bands and the photography, just really interesting. And even just the cover, if you look at the unconventional, dropping the New York Times header upside down on the bottom, with the Billie Eilish upside down as well. One of the 3 covers that they did. I think that there is so much to cover. There's so much that we could have talked about. I want to remind folks, if they weren't with us at the top of the show, that Shri Srinivasan is going to be hosting a series of calls talking about COVID-19. He has one today with Robert Anthony at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join him on uberconference.com/ShriNet and the hashtag Shri COVID-19 call. I think the idea is really to keep connected with folks, find ways to interact, to learn from each other, to bring in experts. He's going to do it at a different time every day based on people's availability. But I think that we're all looking at creative ways to continue our work, continue the interactions, particularly when we're mostly all at home. One of the challenges working from home doesn't mean that work stops. I work with United Way, and we're going to be very busy over the next several days. Lots of local United Ways are responding to COVID-19, helping getting meals to kids in schools, helping people whose jobs are going to be affected. And we'll be making some announcements fairly soon as well around that. Emily is home. Luckily, Pam isn't working at the moment. We're going to be homeschooling effectively for the next few weeks. Laura is reminding us that Yo-Yo Ma is doing songs of comfort on social media, sharing his music, which is great. So with that, Therese is offering a thank you to our production team and for this great community. I want to echo that. Paula, thank you so much for your support in Facebook, and Steve in LinkedIn. I know there were a number of other comments that came in LinkedIn as well. E.B. Moss had asked loading time, it might be an issue with working from home. Absolutely. Just in terms of sharing, I know Francesca had made a comment that Thursday was rough. Francesca Burks, between the markets crashing, the state of emergency in New York, and staff being scared. She described it as a sci-fi movie. And Dennis was asking earlier, Dennis Gonzalez was asking about can we comment on people who contracted COVID-19 but don't show symptoms. I think the challenge is that people don't show symptoms for 2 weeks. And so you could be walking around not knowing that you're a carrier. And I think we have a guest joining us at the very end, a little quick cameo before we finish. Emily, would you like to say hi to everyone?
Hi, everyone. Now I'm going to put my glasses.
You're going to put on your glasses now? So for folks, you've heard me reference her a few times. This is my daughter, Emily. And this is my friend, Libby Copeland. She was our guest today on the show.
Hi, Emily.
And you actually met Libby, but you were only 1.5, I think. Libby, this big, right? When I saw you on the street in Rosedale, pulled over and said hi. She was in the back seat in her car seat.
Yeah.
We were visiting Hastings.
Yeah.
Now we don't have a car seat.
You don't. Well, you have a booster seat, right?
Now you're so tall.
Yeah. So with that, again, I want to thank Libby for joining us. And a couple people are saying hi to Emily, Therese, and Carla, and Janie as well. And Susan, I'll say Paula said hi as well. But Susan said a wonderful reading today. Thank you, Libby. And I think we definitely want to end on that note. Please.
Thank you so much.
Stay healthy. I want to encourage everyone watching to flatten the curve. Stay home.
Yes.
You're showing off your teeth that you lost. Open up your mouth. How many teeth are you missing in there?
Well, I'm missing 3 teeth, but I lost 5.
You lost 5. You lost one even just yesterday. And Nina Morganlander joined as well and watched for a little bit. Another friend of ours from Hastings. So Nina, thank you.
Hi,
and Rochelle, our neighbor from Hastings, is saying hi. And you're with the mom. So thank you, Rochelle, for being such a great neighbor. Really appreciate all the support you've given us. And we'll close with Paula's comment. Thank you for joining us today. Our next guest, before I forget, as I get caught up in enjoying Emily being with us, is going to be Steve Greenhouse, who is a former New York Times labor reporter and author. He's going to be joining us. He just wrote a great book about the American labor movement. So Shri will be hosting next week, and we'll have Steve join us remotely, I'm sure. But with that, we will call this week's show to a close, and thank everyone for spending their Sunday morning with us. And we'll look to do it again next week on the New York Times Read Along.
Stay healthy.
Thank you, everyone.
You, Neil.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.